Hello, my name is Nathan Good. I'm an electrical engineer major at BYU Idaho. This is my senior year. Today we're going to be discussing how much programming and what languages electrical engineers actually need in their major. From my point of view, I'll be talking about C++ and how much exposure we need to C++. From my point of view, here at BYU Idaho, we might be forced to take more C++ than an electrical engineer may need. However, there are positives to taking C++. I do feel that it is a great base language, and knowing C++, we can learn whatever language we may need to learn out in the field. Through my experience at internships in Micron, I noticed that a lot of the other electrical engineers didn't have nearly as much experience as electrical engineers from BYU Idaho had. Here at BYU Idaho, we take 3 C++ classes, 124, 165, and 235, stopping at data structures. And I feel like it would be a better option if we could have the option of choosing how much we want. Certainly there are jobs that require more and less. And knowing your interests as an individual in your studies, you should be able to choose how much C++. Obviously there would be a minimum, but maybe if your interests aren't in that area, you could use another elective instead of taking that much programming.
Hi, I'm Lance Cowick. I'm also an electrical engineer. I'm also in my senior year. My position is going to be on Python and Perl. And in some of the interviews I've done recently, at least 75% of my interviewers have asked if I've had experience in Python and Perl. And as far as classes go, I really haven't received that much instruction or any instruction really on Python or Perl. And I feel like adding at least, part of a semester, maybe the first third of a semester of a class being spent on Python or Perl just to give some experience, some exposure to that language would be really useful for electrical engineers and computer engineers. And if we could add something that covered those kinds of topics, that would be really good. And I know that it's really useful for working in embedded systems. So if it could be rolled into a class relating to embedded systems, that would be really good. I also feel like the current level of programming exposure that we have here is a good amount. We really have an advantage over some of the other schools when it comes to programming, and that's really been something that's gone in my favor in a lot of interviews and in seeking internships, because it seems like no matter what position I've been applying for, they're always looking for at least some sort of programming, whether that's Python and Perl or C or C++ or something else. So I really feel like we do get a good level of exposure.
My name is Scott Wood, and I'm a junior in the program, my electrical engineering program. I'm not part of this decision group, but I'm filling in for 2 persons. One of them has dropped the class, and the second person was not able to show up or did not show up. So I'll be representing the 3rd position, which will be MATLAB. We think that MATLAB should be considered as a programming language here at the school, and that we need more exposure in it, just because it's widely used in various applications, especially with signal processing, image processing, and anything that has to do with matrix math or matrix manipulation. So that will be the 3rd topic for discussion, and we'll just go ahead and start talking about those.
Awesome.
So why don't we start off with where the school's at and whether or not we're getting too much or just the right amount. And what do you guys think we should change?
Awesome. I personally, I really do like how much we get, because I like coding. I like programming. I definitely feel like that's not the same for all electrical engineer majors. I know plenty of friends that really struggled in like 235 and stuff because that just wasn't their forte. That wasn't something that they really liked to do. And really, that's not a career that they were going to choose that is really heavy on that. So if you understand what you're good at and what you want to do, why kill yourself over a class that you're really going to avoid in finding a job?
Yeah, and your GPA too. Kill your GPA.
That as well.
So you think that maybe the school should have two different pathways for electrical engineering major, those who want to focus specifically on hardware or maybe power and that sort of thing, and then the current curriculum, which kind of gives more of a balanced approach between software and hardware.
Exactly, yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Well, you might even have more than two options because, I mean, obviously, when you think about going into electrical engineering, at least this is kind of where I was at when I came in. I was thinking about kind of electrical/electronics, but really, traditionally, electrical engineering is a power engineering type degree. You really don't code in power engineering, so you could have that with like some minimal exposure, maybe some FPGA type coding, for a power degree. So that'd be like one branch. But then a huge industry is semiconductors. And for semiconductors, you use Perl and Python for testing all the time. That's a really common language to be doing tests in. And so you can have a semiconductors path or a silicon-based computing path or whatever they want to call it.
And on that note, with Perl, and something that I didn't really know or had much experience with at Micron, using Perl, most of the time they use it for parsing. And here at school, I mean, I can't even remember a homework assignment or a project that had to do parsing. And that's pretty heavy in the industry. They expect you to know how to parse a huge document of tons of text. And I felt a little unprepared.
I think the only thing I know with parsing is the MATLib program in 124. Yeah. I think it is.
Yeah. And
I still don't even really understand it. I went through and I just put a bunch of if statements in there to get it working. So
they do a little bit of it in 235. There's one of the assignments where you go through. Ours went through some of the family history records, and we had to pull out certain pieces of information from there. But it was one of those things where you were not really understanding the concept. You were just writing code for that specific application, and I didn't really feel like I understood the overall concept of what we were doing. I was just focused on making this work and wasn't really worried about doing it in the best way. And because it's a data structures class, they're more worried about the structure that you're putting those things into than what you're doing to actually get them out of the file. And if I can jump back to the point you made about power engineering, it's true that I feel like we have too much exposure, but I think that there needs to be at least a minimum level. And because I interviewed with SEL, and they do a lot of power applications, and even there, they wanted to know if I had worked in embedded systems, if I had some scripting experience, and so they weren't really as concerned with my C++ experience, but they were still looking for at least a certain level of coding. And so I think even if the school did offer different tracks, some amount of coding needs to be required. Whether people like it or not, they're going to have to deal with it, because in our day and age, even the purely power applications, they have code they're going to have to deal with.
Yeah.
So.
That's true. I mean, even their like all substations, a lot of the time they're running some sort of script or code.
Okay, our second subject was
Which language we should be using?
Python.
Yeah, so the school's approach going with C, I feel, is really good because C really gives you a solid foundation for coding, and for some people, the level is probably more than what they're going to need. But it feels like if you learn C and C++ and you have some exposure to assembly, learning any other higher language comes so much easier than if you start out in a high-level language and then you try to go backwards and go down to C. I see it in some of the classes where people are coming from working in like Python exclusively or Java exclusively, and then they're trying to learn C and their eyes are just rolling up in their heads because there's all these concepts that they just don't have to deal with the higher level languages. So
Yeah, and I had a really good experience with that in my first internship. It was one of the ways I was able to impress my employer was the fact I walked in and they asked me, "Do you know Perl?" My first day of work. "Do you know Perl?" No, because they wanted me to do an online application, an internal online application. So they asked me, "Do you know Perl? Do you know HTML? Do you know JavaScript? Do you know CSS?" I didn't know any of those. But because I knew C, within a week and a half, I was flying on Perl. I had my first HTML thing up and running. And it really came back to my base of C++. And it was tremendously valuable, and I could show that I could learn anything that they threw at me because I had that foundation. So I do agree with you there. Although if we are saying if lower level is better and then working up, then why don't we go as low as assembly?
yeah, I mean, I think jumping straight into assembly involves too much requisite knowledge for the hardware.
That's true.
So you'd have to put off learning C for a good couple semesters in order to get that hardware foundation knowledge to be able to learn assembly. And really, if you are kind of learning C and the hardware at the same time, the way the school currently does it, then when they kind of bring those together and pull you up from the hardware into assembly and down from C at the same time, I think it makes a really good connection. I do feel like that it needs to be a hard requirement to have some exposure to assembly, and I think it should be early enough into the program that you're not totally forgetting about the hardware, or some of the computer science guys who don't get as much exposure to the hardware. I feel like if they went into assembly earlier on when they had more of a rudimentary understanding of C or C++, it would be an easier transition for them to go down and think about assembly before they learn all these, more complex algorithms and all these ways to think about code. If they, before they get to that point, were exposed to assembly, that it would be a smoother transition. So,
I think that the 260 class does a really good job of doing that. I think it is required for electrical engineers, is it not? Not for CS, but I think for electrical engineers.
I'm not sure if it's required for computer engineers as well. It probably is, but I don't think computer science is required to take it.
I don't think so.
And I think it really should be a required course for computer science, because it really teaches you to think about code in a way that is different from standard computer science.
I actually think that the coursework, like the course material that we have as electrical engineers, is pretty good as far as code with C. I think again with the Python and the Perl that we could use more of it if we're planning on doing like a semiconductor type thing.
Yeah.
But also, I think MATLAB is something that we should. I don't feel like I have enough exposure to MATLAB. I think we should have more exposure to that.
Yeah, I did.
My exposure to MATLAB pretty much consists of what we did in 316, which was really just super basic matrix math, which is kind of like a joke as far as what MATLAB is capable of. It's like taking one drop out of a giant bucket of water and then saying, "Oh, I've had enough."
Yeah.
So I agree that MATLAB really should be something that's taught and not like, oh, you know C, so we're just going to throw you into MATLAB. I think that a class that maybe went through an introduction to Python and Perl, an introduction to MATLAB, and maybe an introduction to like HTML and Java as well, because I know those are some of the languages that we don't really get exposure to, and spending a lot of time on them I feel like would be more than what an electrical engineer needs, but to have a really nice introduction so that if you go to an interview and they're like, hey, have you worked in these, you can say, yeah, I've got a little bit of experience in those, and I'm not, the strongest, but I at least know what the language is. I know some of the basic syntax with it, because really when you're learning a new language, it's the syntax that you have to learn that is the hardest part of it.
I think, though, for engineering, I mean, although it would be nice to have those other languages, I don't think they're as crucial as MATLAB is. MATLAB is,
Definitely agree.
If you're just talking about noise filtering, the capability of MATLAB to set up a noise filter for any sort of application is just incredible. Or if you're doing like a Kalman filter or any of that. It's awesome. For aerospace and aeronautical design.
Image
processing, if you're doing coordinate frame, what do you call that? Transitioning? When you're translating from one coordinate frame to another. There's all kinds of packages for that kind of stuff. And as electrical engineers, I mean, the range of our field is so wide. I mean, we could go into almost anything. If you're building missiles for Raytheon or for Lockheed or Hill Air Force Base, I mean, it might be a good idea to know that.
Yeah. And I know they do offer 241 now. I didn't have the opportunity to take that class, and I'm sure it would have helped. I walked into a brick wall going into 480, which is all MATLAB, and I hadn't really had any exposure to it. So that would have really helped me in that class, and being able to put that on my transcript or on my resume. Showing employers that I know MATLAB. I think that's huge in the industry.
Yeah, definitely. And it's something, because it seems like with MATLAB, they kind of just, the classes that you have exposure to it, at least the ones I've taken, they're kind of just like, here's MATLAB, do stuff with it. Right. And there's no really introduction to like, here's how you do things in MATLAB. It's kind of like, here's our specific application we want you to use MATLAB for, and go do that. And you really don't ever get that basic foundation for just working in MATLAB regardless of what the application you're using it for is.
For example, in 241, they basically take the data structures class and say, oh, hey, build a queue or a linked list or whatever in MATLAB. And it's like, I don't know, it's just weird because you would never really do that. So I think it would be way better to have something where they go through and they actually have a more thorough view of it.
To what MATLAB does.
Yeah. So
interesting. Awesome. Well, so from what I can gather from this discussion is, one, we like the amount of programming that we are offered.
Yeah.
Maybe some varying of options.
Maybe a little less C, a little more
less C, a little more Python, or being able to make your choice.
Yeah.
Say I want more this, say I want more of that. So maybe some more power to the students in choosing. But overall, more is better.
Yeah.
Yeah, so long as
Not
we're
too
still,
much more.
Yeah, as long as we're still getting the other aspects of engineering that we need to learn. Yeah,
For sure.
because the more exposure we have to different languages and just using languages, I feel it's going to be an advantage. So.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Thanks.
Yep.
Awesome discussion.